starving the sensibility of our pupils will only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For a famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. The average person, their minds, their hearts have not been fortified with just sentiments. That is, with good sentiments, with true sentiments, because the propagandist is able to play upon their emotions, not so much with logic, but with emotion, and win them over. When you talk to some youth and you discover that they're full of angst and anger, even hatred for their own country, for God, why is that? It's because their minds have been polluted with this. They've not been educated, they have been indoctrinated. But it's not just happening to students. It's not just students I'm talking about here. You're seeing it in the Western world. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. In the 1940s, during World War II in Britain, there was a debate taking place in education circles, that is, among educators themselves, about the best way to prevent Hitlers. Seeing what was taking place across the world, a world war, millions of people being killed, Britain itself being threatened with invasion, people were kind of asking themselves, how did we get here? How did we get to this place where this megalomaniac, Hitler, has risen to power, and where millions of people are willing to follow him to their own doom? How is it that a Mussolini has risen to similar kinds of power, to such great heights where millions of people are ready to follow him? Or what's happening in Russia with Joseph Stalin, the same thing. Millions of people following all of them, and millions of people being killed by them. How do we prevent that? We as educators, how do we prevent that? How do we educate our children in such a way that things like this don't happen? This was the discussion that was taking place. And C.S. Lewis, who, of course, himself, we know of him as an author of fiction, but C.S. Lewis was an educator. He taught at Oxford University. He taught at Cambridge University. My good friend, Professor John Lennox, was actually a student of his at Cambridge University. And Lewis chimed in on the debate about educating kids with this little book that's called The Abolition of Man. Now, The Abolition of Man is, I don't know, what is this book, 90 pages or so? Yeah, it's about 90 pages, very, very easy to acquire on Amazon or whatever your favorite bookseller is, and to read. But if you go into reading this book without knowing what the background is, it's one of Lewis's more obscure publications, because the arguments themselves can feel a little abstruse, because if you like that context, you may wonder what kind of conversation it is that you've been dropped in on. Well, having the background that I've just given you, Lewis says something here. I read this when I was an undergraduate in London. I managed to find a copy of this book in an old bookseller. And to begin with, it was kind of hard slogging, not so much because of the vocabulary or anything like that, just because I wasn't quite sure who he was responding to. What are you talking? It was like kind of hearing one side of a phone conversation. But now having the context that I didn't have at that time, what Lewis was responding to, what he was talking about, there's a line here that I find really quite profound, and it's this. Pay close attention. My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are three who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibilities of our students, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For a famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. Now, let me explain what Lewis is saying there. The prevailing wisdom went in an opposite direction of what Lewis here says. The argument was moving in a direction that said, aha, the way we prevent the rise of Hitlers and Stalins and Mussolinis and Maos and so on is you have to identify those kids in your classes. You have to identify who the potential Hitlers and Stalins are. And then what you have to do is you have to beat out of them, not literally, but you have to beat out of them intellectually the bad ideas that are in their heads, thus educating them with something of moral value so that they become better people and they don't eventually grow up to become totalitarian maniacs. That was the thinking. But Lewis comes along and it says, no, that's the wrong approach, and it's never going to work, in part because kids like that, there's already something broken with them, seriously broken with them. They're spiritually broken. You're not going to drive those bad ideas out most of the time. He says, no, the danger is this, that, again, to repeat here, for every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, in other words, for every one student with a bent towards becoming a totalitarian, for every one of those, he says, there are 3 students who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. In other words, there are 3 students who have no ideas at all. And thus they become easy prey to the propagandist when he comes. Now, why am I talking about C.S. Lewis this morning? Why is he on my mind? As I've been paying attention to, like you, to what's taking place across the Western world, there's something that we're seeing here that's really a quite extraordinary phenomenon, and that is where Western nations, Western governments, Western people in general seem to be prepared to surrender their entire societies, indeed Western civilization as a whole, to serve it up on a platter and to hand it over to people who want to destroy it. And those people come on in a couple of varieties. There is the militant secularists, the kind of people that gather at the World Economic Forum, the WEF, where I go each year at Davos, Switzerland, and sit amongst them and listen to all their ideas. Those are people who they're fundamentally godless, and interestingly enough, they're becoming increasingly neo-pagan, but that's a discussion for another time. But when you go there and you sit amongst them, just listening, again, I don't go with cameras or mics or anything like that. I'm just going just to be an observer, just to be a fly on the wall, because they speak much more honestly, when you do that than when you shove a camera in their face. But what comes out is that beneath all of the sophisticated jargon, beneath all of the do-gooder language, is a fundamental hatred for God, a fundamental hatred for the West, and a fundamental belief that they are the representatives of a new age, that they're the people who are going to usher in utopia. They're real believers in this. It's really quite amazing. And these are people who, at least by modern standards, are deemed to be well-educated, most of them extremely wealthy. But they're lacking any kind of meaningful moral education, or at least that's what the impression that I always come away with. So you have that on the one hand. I'll call it a militant secularism, a militant globalism that is driving the destruction of the West on that side. On the other side, you have what I'll call militant Islam. I hate to call it militant or radical Islam, because, as I've said many times on this show, the people we call militants or radicals are in fact just orthodox lowercase o, are just Orthodox Muslims who take very seriously their religion, but we're stuck with the language. We have to kind of use the terminology in order to be clear in what we're saying. But these are individuals who are coming and they're gradually, they're advancing all over in the West. At certain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated, inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. Alpha Omega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team help clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, Alpha Omega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. So today, go and visit www.ao.gold/IHC or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. They're taking city by city by coming and breeding out the occupants of those cities or those countries. And again, as I stated in a previous, I think the last episode of Ideas Have Consequences, the average African Muslim male may have between 25 and north of 100, children. And that's because, according to Islamic law, he's allowed to have as many as 4 wives, and he can have endless concubines, mistresses, and Islam is about reproduction. That's part of the ideology of conquest, is to outbreed. We already know Elon Musk talks about this rightly quite a lot, about the declining birth rates throughout the West. It's not sufficient to maintain the population. And when you add to that, things like Planned Parenthood and the constant discussion of fear of overpopulation, which has gone on since the 1960s, and then well before that, the 1790s, Thomas Malthus, alarming people with talk of some kind of population explosion. Those are ideas that have advanced in the West to such a place that we find ourselves with catastrophically falling birth rates. And Muslims are coming into cities like Rotherham and like London and like Paris and like Berlin and all over the Western world, and now New York, Dearborn, Michigan, where we are seeing the advance of this religion that's less of a religion than it is an ideology of conquest. Again, something we've talked about on here before. But again, what is it? We know what militant secularism is. That's been there for a very long time. And the West has generally resisted it because it's come in the form of fascism. It's come in the form of communism. We fought a world war and a Cold War in order to defeat those ideologies, or at the very least to hold them at bay. So we know what that is. We're very familiar with that. And our forefathers, they fought those battles in order to preserve the West, in order to preserve America as we then knew it. And we've known what Islam is. We've been at war. The West has been at war with Islam since before the Crusades. There were 14 Crusades, and that's not including modern day, warfare. But now we're at a place where the West is no longer fighting these things. It's giving them the keys to the castle. It's handing over Western civilization. How is that happening? What's going on? What's the mindset that we see people doing these kinds of things? What's going on in the minds of people in Britain who are defending Islam when they know very well that the rise in violent crime, the rise in sexual assault, that it's all very real, that they are seeing that the government is not just simply opening borders, but facilitating an invasion of an alien ideology. What's going on with that people seem to accept it? What's going on with New Yorkers, where in a free and open election, New Yorkers and 30% of Jews, absolutely astonishing, voted for Mandani, a jihadist? What's going on with that? What is happening there? Well, this brings me back to C.S. Lewis, to what Lewis is saying here. And it's profound because of the times in which we live. Again, going back to the debate that Lewis is talking about here, people were rightly alarmed to see the millions of Germans. Germany was considered to be a very culturally sophisticated nation of the 1930s and 40s. How is it, this wasn't a third world country, how is it that a country like this, a country where there had been, at least at one point in time, a vibrant and active church, was now sliding into a kind of neo-paganism, which is what Nazism certainly was, and where millions of people are going out into the street and they're Sieg Heiling. They're out there, some of them, girls weeping, when they're seeing Adolf Hitler driving by and his Mercedes, who want to touch him, who would stand outside for hours down in Berchtesgaden, down where he had his capital in the south of Germany, wait for hours for him to come outside and to acknowledge them in some small way, or perhaps to sign an autograph, sign a copy of Mein Kampf. What's going on with that? People wondered. And why is it that they're buying in wholesale into this ideology? Well, of course, we're seeing it now. We're seeing it primarily among youth, and also between unhappy, middle-aged white women who are themselves unfulfilled, unhappy, and who are becoming a demographic that, in terms of the way that they vote, they tend to vote very heavily to the left. They tend to be the demographic that is sort of the swing voters who are ushering in the Mandanis, who are ushering in the Sakid Khans, the mayor of London, who are ushering in virulent leftist ideology. What is going on with that? Well, again, Lewis here tells us the reason for it. He's saying that the average person, their minds, their hearts have not been fortified with just sentiments, that is, with good sentiments, with true sentiments, and thus they're easy prey, he says, for the propagandist when he comes, because the propagandist is able to play upon their emotions, not so much with logic, but with emotion, and win them over. By starving the sensibility of our pupils will only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For a famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. That's so true. That's so true. A term that is frequently used to describe this phenomenon of the West. I had a book that was sitting right here. It's probably here in the studio somewhere, but it's called The Suicide of the West. Not actually a great book, but the title is dead on. The Suicide of the West. It isn't like this clash of civilizations is occurring on a battlefield, and that the West lost, and now they are, the defeated, the vanquished, and our conquerors are coming in and occupying our capitals. That's not what's happening. What is happening is the West is rolling over and handing over its civilization. And I've heard some refer to this as toxic empathy, or suicidal empathy, as it is sometimes called. I don't like the term, either of those terms, suicidal empathy or toxic empathy. I don't care for them, and I don't because I don't think they're accurate. Empathy Empathy is selfless. It's even noble. When someone empathizes with you, they don't sympathizing with you just simply means that they, maybe hurt for you. It's just too bad, that this thing happened to you. You broke your leg, let's say, or you lost a loved one. Empathy is to try for someone to try to enter into your suffering with you. To empathize with someone means to sort of try to, you're not just simply a bystander observing, sympathizing, but empathy is an act. It's putting a shoulder under the burden in an effort to try to ease it for you. The empathizer is someone who goes beyond the sympathizer. So empathy is generally a noble act, and what we're seeing here, it's not selfish. Excuse me, it's not selflessness that we're seeing. It's quite the opposite. It's a kind of virtue signaling selfishness that we're seeing. It's cowardice cloaked as empathy. It's cowardice cloaked as something that is noble. And there's nothing noble about surrendering what others have bequeathed to you at the cost of their own blood and their own lives. Our forefathers fought to give us a freedom. They fought to give us religious freedom. They fought to give us freedom of speech. They fought to give us a land in which we could flourish. There's nothing noble about handing it over and surrendering it to other people. It's a betrayal to your forefathers, but it's also a betrayal to your children, to your grandchildren. It's a betrayal to those who come behind us, because we have a responsibility to give them a better world, or at least endeavor to do so. It's part of what very much drives me to do what I do. I was looking at a picture the other day, or a little video that my son sent to me of their newborn child. And looking at him, the thought ran through my head, what a sweet, handsome little boy he is. And thinking to myself, boy, I need to step up my game. I need to fight a little bit harder, because by the time this child reaches adulthood, I want to have played a role in handing him and delivering him a world that is better than the one that he's been born into, or is at least as good. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. And because I'm also very clear on my mission as a Christian, what it is that I am called to do. But again, this mass surrender of the West, it's brought on by a cowardice that is a result of the spiritual vacuousness of the West. That's Lewis's point. The propagandist capitalizes on empty-minded, empty-hearted people. That's his audience. That's his power. And if you deny him an audience, then you deny him his power. Don't worry about identifying the Stalins and the Hitlers in your midst. Instead, focus on educating, equipping, fortifying the hearts and minds of those to whom he will speak. And when you do that, you reduce an Adolf Hitler to simply being a crackpot standing on a street corner or posting, silly troll-like things online. He becomes irrelevant. But when the masses are spiritually empty, nature, as I say, abhors a vacuum, and something is going to fill it. And this is what we've been seeing in the West. I have been reminded this year, in many ways, I am in my heart really a teacher. I enjoy much more speaking to a smaller group of people than I do to speaking to vast audiences. Speaking to thousands of people, you're up on stage and the lights are bright and shining in your face, and you can't really see the people who are down in front of you. It's one of the things I don't like, actually, about doing a show like this, because there's no audience here that I see. I'm looking into a camera. I'm looking into a monitor. And the teacher in my heart, I like seeing people because, teachers become experts. At least I feel that I've become an expert at reading body language. They're giving you visual cues, usually subconsciously, of what you're saying. And it's helpful because a facial expression may reveal to you, this person isn't understanding what I'm saying. I need to restate it. Or this person's body language tells me they're resisting what I'm saying. They don't like what I'm saying. Or this person here is leaning in. They're really listening and they're enjoying, appreciating what I'm saying. Or, someone over here is napping. I got to try to win that guy over. Wake him up. I taught for so many years. I taught for, I don't know, multiple times a week in some capacity for, let's say, 25 years. And I've been reminded, I do so much less of that these days because I'm in front of cameras like this. And it's easy to forget when you're not actually in front of live audiences, is to forget some of the basics of teaching. And I don't mean the principles of teaching, but some of the things that you learn from it. And one of the things I've been reminded of this past year is how much youth, how much they long for mission, how much they long for meaning. And on those occasions when I get the opportunity to speak to high school or college age students about my work, and I know how to speak to them in a way that appeals to them, and I'll bring some video of some of the things that we do. It might be a single prop plane flying into a Colombian cartel town, or it might be me aboard a ship in the Panama Canal, or it might be me and outside of Cairo and the pyramids, or perhaps of the World Economic Forum, whatever. And then I begin to talk about my work in a way that's meaningful because I believe in what I do. I believe in the marrow of my bones. And that passion, that sincerity comes through. And I can feel them leaning in. I can really feel them leaning in. I don't care if I'm speaking to at a Christian school or students from a public school. It makes no difference. They lean in, they're excited, they're interested because it looks like great adventure. And of course, some of it is, much of it is. And they're longing for mission. They're longing for meaning. They're longing for challenges. Boys especially want to be challenged, and they want to be challenged physically. When they feel the strength of youth coming upon them, they want to they want to test the limits, of their strength, and they want to test the limits of their minds, but they want mission. And this year, I've really been reminded of that as I've had more opportunities to get in front of kids and watching their eyes light up when I start talking about my work and when I begin to show them those images is very, very real. And parents, you're failing when you don't point them in the right direction and give them that mission. And personally, I think that mission is found in the person of Jesus Christ. I think it's found in the Great Commission that we go into all the world, evangelizing. My calling is 2 Corinthians 10:5, where the Apostle Paul says, we demolish arguments and every lofty opinion that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. That is my mission. That's what I do here on this show. I demolish arguments and I build arguments in an effort to equip you. But you see, if kids aren't given that, if they aren't given meaning, if they aren't given mission by their parents, if they aren't given a good mission, if they aren't given proper meaning, they are going to find it in bad meaning. They're going to find it in bad meaning. And that's what we're seeing happening across the West, where we're seeing people handing over their culture. And it's because they have no ideas at all. Not really. When you begin scratching the surface and engaging with members of an Antifa or a BLM, students in universities who are extremely woke, almost none of them can defend their position. And very few of them can explain to you beyond some kind of emotional outburst what it is that they actually believe. They can't articulate it. It's just something that for them feels bigger and more meaningful than their lives are without it. And because their minds, their hearts were not filled with just sentiments, they have found meaning in bad sentiments. This is in part the appeal of the Joker, Heath Ledger's Joker, I'm thinking of here in the Batman movies. What is the appeal of that character? Why is it that that character overshadowed the star of the show, Batman? I think it has to do with his clarity of purpose, which is chaos, which is anarchy. Characters like that have appeal, and they have appeal especially for young people. It isn't that they don't recognize that he's evil. They know that he's evil, but they find his clarity of purpose appealing. And so the Joker became, for so many kids watching those films, the Joker became for them their protagonist, the hero, the star of the show, because of his clarity of purpose, even if it's an evil purpose. In this book, I started to say little book. It's not a little book. It's an enormous book. This book right here by Orlando Figes, historian. This book right here came out, I think, in 1997, about almost 30 years ago, and it's called A People's Tragedy, A History of the Russian Revolution. Now, my purpose today isn't really discussing the history of the Russian Revolution, but I read this book when it came out, and it is an excellent book. It's an excellent history of the Russian Revolution. But Figes says several things in this book that I think are quite profound. But one of them is this, and in this particular edition, I think it's found, really chiefly on pages 126 and 127, but the issue is brought up again at another time. Figes is answering the question that he poses to himself: how do we explain the rise of the Bolsheviks, the triumph of the Bolsheviks? How do we explain the rise of the USSR when something like that didn't happen in Western Europe? Marxism did not triumph in Western Europe. It did not triumph in America. Why did it in Russia? And Figes' answer, I think, is quite fascinating. He says that the triumph of Marxism in 1917 Russia can be attributed to the fact that there were no viable competing ideologies, that there were no viable competing ideologies. It sort of matches what Lewis is saying in this book. Lewis is saying you must fortify the hearts and minds of the students, of the people in general, with that which is true and that which is good, so that when the propagandist comes, they ignore him because they know that what he's saying is nonsense. But if the people are spiritually, intellectually void, bad things happen. And Figes, who I doubt has read this book, is essentially saying that what Lewis is warning against happened to an entire country. The entire country was void of that which was good and that which was true. But how did that happen? Why did it happen there and not in France, not in Britain, not in the United States? We could argue that it's happening now, and I think that it is. But a century ago, it didn't happen. Why? He says it has everything to do with censorship, that censorship backfired on the Russians very badly. And that is because, he says, that the censors had decided, let me see if I can find it here. The censors had decided that no one was going to read Marx's books because they were too complicated. Who wants to read it? But this is what he has to say about this. He says that let me see here. Here's what one of the censors wrote upon reading Das Kapital, Capital, when it was submitted to the censors for them. Russia at this time, Tsarist Russia, just like the Bolsheviks after them, allowed almost nothing to be published in Tsarist Russia that was deemed to be in any way, shape, or form a threat to the autocracy there, to the absolute monarchy that existed in that country. So if they deemed it to be a threat, they just said, no, you can't publish it. And so this is what one of the censors had to say about this 674 pages of dense statistical analyses. It was deemed too much, too difficult, too abstruse for it to be seditious. Said the censor, it's possible to state with certainty that very few people in Russia will read this book, and even fewer will understand it. Moreover, added the second censor, since the author attacked the British factory system, his critique is not applicable to Russia, where the capitalist exploitation of what he speaks of has never been in Russia. So again, they decided there's no harm in letting Das Kapital being published here because the capitalist system it's attacking doesn't exist in Russia. They're attacking chiefly Britain. And as for the rest of the book, it's just complicated factory analyses. Nobody's going to read this book. But guess what, says Figes. The book was published, and it very quickly achieved a kind of cult status and following. Why? Because there was nothing else. Socialists in Russia were longing for literary allies. They were longing for literary allies who could equip them to overthrow the government. And here comes Marx with his complicated book that was full not of truth, not of the good, but of the evil, of the bad, of the false. But they seized upon it. They loved it. They had book discussion groups about it, and it became the basis for their revolution. And it had everything to do with censorship, ironically, because there were no other books critiquing Marx that were allowed to be published. You see, the reason, says Figes, Marxism didn't triumph in the West is because there weren't censors. There wasn't this mass censorship. Thus, everything was being published. There was a true marketplace of ideas that Marxism had to compete in, and it couldn't win. And it was subjected to withering reviews, withering critiques, withering attacks. Because scholars were saying, we've read that. We've moved on from it because it's nonsense. But you see, in Russia, there was none of that. There was just Marx, because he'd managed to slip through the censors' defenses. And shortly after its publication, the censors realized the mistake they had made because the government now was in serious trouble. Isn't that ironic? Isn't it ironic? But it brings us back to C.S. Lewis. Lewis is saying these things happen when people have no intellectual defenses against them. Now, that brings us to where we are today. When you see on the news kids marching and burning down the cities they live in, when you talk to some youth and you discover that they're full of angst and anger, even hatred for their own country, for God, why is that? It's because their minds have been polluted with this. They've not been educated, they have been indoctrinated. But it's not just happening to students. It's not just students I'm talking about here. You're seeing it in the Western world. A people handing over their whole civilization. It's C.S. Lewis's point. But it's also a point that Blaise Pascal, a personal hero of mine, made centuries ago. Blaise Pascal, who was at once one of the greatest artists, philosophers, scientists, and theologians who ever lived. Blaise Pascal had been an atheist. And he became a Christian. And Pascal said this, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said this. He said, a ship needs a fixed point in order to navigate. Otherwise, how can it judge its course? It needs a fixed point. That might become Polaris, the North Star. He says it might become, if the ship is close enough to shore, it might become a harbor or some other object on land. We've all had that sensation. If you've ever been at sea, or it could even be on just a very large lake, and you cannot see the shore, you can be deceived about your movement or lack thereof, because you might be moving at the same pace as the current. Or maybe the water is dead. Maybe there's just a ripple on the top. But you may have the sensation of movement when you're not moving at all. Or how many times, particularly if you drive a stick, have you been sitting at a stoplight and you're rolling back just a little bit, but you think it's the car next to you that's moving when the car isn't moving? Or the opposite. That car is rolling back or moving, but you panic because you think you're moving. And Blaise Pascal is saying, in order to judge your course, you have to have a fixed point. For a ship, it's Polaris, or it's something on land to judge its course. But then he says, where shall we find a fixed point in morality? You have to have a fixed point in morality. And the question that he asks there is rhetorical, because for him, it was a capital F and a capital P, fixed point. Jesus Christ, that's what he meant. If you are to have a fixed point in morality, it must be anchored in the absolute. And I think the only real absolute, the only good and true absolute, is the person of Jesus Christ. And how are you to find him? How are you to understand his will? How are you to find that fixed point? You find it in his word. You find it in Scripture. And it helps you judge your course. And that's so incredibly important, because I'm seeing so many people these days who are deeply distressed when they see a favorite podcaster who perhaps has gone off the rails. And they start thinking, well, is this what I'm supposed to believe now? Maybe their pastor has gone woke. Maybe a favorite politician, possibly, a celebrity of some sort, who's begun endorsing something that previously they thought was evil. And I see this with people all the time who have put their hope in individuals like this, and thus they lack a fixed point. You see, people will fail you. And when that person, when that pastor, when that podcaster begins spouting nonsense, their whole worldview is uprooted, and they themselves blow with whatever winds come along, because they lack a fixed point. Now, if you have a real fixed point in your life, if you're anchored in the person of Jesus Christ and you know his word, then you won't be too distressed. I mean, you might be in the sense that you feel a sadness when you see someone embracing lies and spouting them, promoting, teaching false things, it might fill you with sadness to see that. I've felt that many times. But it won't uproot your life because you'll recognize it, because you will have a fixed point. And you see, Western culture, as it has abandoned Christianity, as Christianity has declined, there has been a corresponding rise in these false ideologies that we're seeing, places like the West, this militant, aggressive, globalist secularism, and the advancement of Islam. And in part because both of them have a great appeal to people because they claim to be good and they claim to be absolute, and they, at least on the part of secularism, claims to be scientific. Islam claims to be God's truth. So there is appeal to that. There are a lot of young people who convert to Islam in the West because it feels better than believing nothing. It feels better to embrace something that's bigger than yourself, that claims to be the truth, and that provides you with a real mission. An evil one, I would say, but a mission nonetheless. And again, it's like the Joker. Kids would rather embrace the Joker than to have no mission at all, to have no meaning at all. The West needs a fixed point. And if the West is to push back at the advancement of evil that we're seeing in our culture, there must be spiritual revival. There must be spiritual revival. I know some feel that the assassination of Charlie Kirk is leading, in that direction, that Turning Point USA might become the kernel of that great a third Great Awakening. I hope so. That would be wonderful. Maybe it'll happen somewhere else or in some other way. But the fact of the matter is, it must happen if the West is to survive, because a spiritually vapid people are no match for the aggressive ideologies that are advancing in the West. They just aren't. Lori and I, when we were raising our 4 children, I knew from personal experience, from all of my years of engaging with youth, that we had to fortify their hearts and minds if our children were to stand tall in this world. We had to equip them to navigate, to understand the world, not through dad's opinions and mom's opinions per se, but through spiritual truth, which is found in God's word, which meant intense scripture memorization for our children, knowing it would serve them well later in life, and intense theological education and intense exposure to the world while we are holding their hands and interacting with them about the things that they're seeing. What do you think of that? Is that true? Is that good? I mentioned this on a podcast a few weeks ago, talking about parenting, how we would ask our children, what do they think of an ad? What message do you think is being communicated in that? Or what they thought of a TV show or a piece of music. Music is a great way, by the way, to elicit, conversation with kids. What do you think? What do you think of that? When Eric Clapton is singing cocaine, what's he talking about there? What's that song about? Well, Dad, I think he's talking about an addiction that he's had and how easy it was to fall into it and how it promised him all kinds of things that it never delivered. I think you're on to something there. Most people just let the ideas that are being circulated in the culture just penetrate them like so many gamma rays. They never process them. They don't think about them. And it begins to subtly affect their thinking negatively. You have to have a fixed point. You have to equip your children, your grandchildren, with a fixed point. And there must be spiritual revival in the West if the West is to resist all the things that are happening. You cannot be your own fixed point. And that is because you are not a fount of wisdom. You are not an anchor of absolute truth. A.W. Tozer, the theologian A.W. Tozer, said this: the Lord says, I am that I am. He's quoting scripture when he says that. The Lord says, I am that I am. Everyone and everything, said Tozer, must measure from that fixed point. And boy, was he ever right in saying that. So when you have that fixed point, you're able to measure and test everything against it. But the spiritual void that we are seeing in the West is being filled with something very, very wicked. And I'll go further than that. We're not doing a very good job, I think, of educating our kids to identifying evil ideologies and how to resist them. How many of our kids, how many of our seminaries are teaching their students about these things? I would suggest to you almost none. I think you could count them on one hand, maybe on just a couple of fingers that are doing it. How many schools are doing it? I would suggest not very many. Not very many are doing it. So when you look and you see all that's happening in the West, when you see this so-called toxic empathy, when you see people handing over their civilization, their city, know that it has everything to do with the fact, says C.S. Lewis, that people are easy prey to the propagandist when he comes, when they have no ideas at all. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.